Evidence Not Seen by Darlene Deibler, Rose. Returning to the barracks, I was told that Mr. Yamaji wanted Rose David to report to the office immediately. Good gracious, what does he want? Rose exclaimed as she hurried toward the office. I checked on the sick ones in our barracks and made work detail substitutions. Coming back through the barracks, I realized that Rose had not yet returned. After the doctor made his rounds, Rose was still absent. I felt concerned. What now? Should I go to the office and check to see what had detained her? I prayed for wisdom and started across the camp toward the office. On my way, I saw Mrs. Joustra's messenger and called to her, "Mrs. Voskul, have you seen Rose David?" Coming up to me, she casually put her arm through mine, turned me around, and started to walk me back to Barracks 8. The commander is furious. The baggage of everyone who was taken to Parapara yesterday was examined. He found that Rose had sent a package to her husband with the boys from her barracks. He has imprisoned her in one of the small huts down by the edge of the camp past the piggery, saying she is to be hanged. The carpenter has been ordered to find a rope and set up a scaffold. No one is to go near her. That's all I can tell you. I returned to the barracks feeling physically sick. I confided in Ruth, and we prayed for Rose's safety. It is true that they had said no letters, but nothing had been said about packages. Unfortunately, Rose had wrapped the socks she had knit for Carr and had written his name on the outside of the parcel. Even the sight of Rose's handwriting would have greatly cheered her husband, but that was not to be. Elsie and the boys received the news quietly, and only by the clenching of their jaws and the pallor of their faces did they betray their agitation and concern. The afternoon was a long vigil. I tried to work on the road while keeping the office in sight. When the bell rang that we might return to our barracks, Rose had not been released, and Mr. Yamaji was nowhere to be seen. Supper was eaten quietly. Our emotions ran the gamut from anger at the Japanese, to anxiety for Rose, to frustration at her helplessness, to fear of further reprisals, to despair over the injustices we had already experienced, to a certain knowledge that our situation was not improving. We cried to God for help. Then, out of the experiences of a day that now seemed so remote, I heard Russell whisper, "Remember, dear, God said He would never, never leave us nor forsake us." Hope surfaced, and I rose to go to Rose's boys when someone cried out, "Rose is coming!" My impulse was to rush to her, but we all were schooling ourselves never to give the Japanese the satisfaction of knowing our fears and the distress they caused us. At evening prayers, our hearts beat as one as we voiced our thanks to God that Yamaji's anger had dissipated as the day wore on, and Rose had been returned to us greatly shaken, weak from hunger, but unharmed. The Japanese were fond of pork, and the Army of Occupation needed a steady source of supply, so the piggery had top priority. A new structure was constructed of planks with cement floors. The pigs were given more consideration and had better accommodations than the women prisoners. Our dirt floors degenerated into mud floors during the rainy season and dust bowls in the dry time. However, for the sake of those who worked in the piggery, we were thankful. A well was sunk nearby, from which uncounted buckets of water were lugged daily for the scrubbing and rinsing of the cement floors to maintain a sanitary level of living for those animals. The camp commander shot dogs in the surrounding villages, which the women skinned, cut up, and cooked with the stems of the banana plant in preparing the hot meals for the pigs. Bamboo was gathered in a nearby grove for the cooking fires. It paid to have connections at the piggery. I could taste no difference in flavor between dog liver and calf liver. The commander got wind of the disposition of the dog livers and ordered it stopped. After all, the poor pigs needed the nourishment. The sows that were farrowing had to be kept under surveillance at night as well. Only the physically strong were able to cope with the long hours and heavy work required in the piggery. So it fell to the lot of the unmarried girls or young married women without children to be responsible for Kampili's prime industry. After a stint at the piggery, I walked into our barracks kitchen to hear Commander Yamaji giving instructions for fireplaces on which we could set our open half drums for boiling drinking water. I dared to suggest that if they would lay a whole drum on its side and cement it into the firebox, there would be a greater area of the drum exposed to the flame, thus requiring less bamboo to boil twice the amount of water. Further, the piece cut from the top of the exposed part of the drum could be flattened to serve as a lid to keep out the smoke. In my enthusiastic explanation of how it ought to be done, I hadn't realized how quiet he had become. I turned to get his reaction and saw his hand raised to strike. I caught the full force of the blow across my shoulder and the back of my neck. "You talk too much," he yelled and stomped off. It was a fight to keep the tears from spilling over, but the following day the workmen were cementing in the drums as I had suggested. The blow was a small price to pay for the added convenience and for drinking water free of the acrid bamboo smoke flavor we had always had in the open-topped half-drum. Where you have pigs, you have flies, and where you have flies to contaminate the food and water, dysentery can become pandemic seemingly overnight. It spread so rapidly that even the camp commander was quite shaken, because it was robbing him of his large workforce. He decided that an isolation ward should be built for dysentery patients on the outer perimeter of the camp. Before the building, not unlike our barracks, was completed, he ordered the nurses to start shifting critically ill patients to the new structure. Elsie David, her friend Nita, a nurse's aide, and Sister Romolda, head of the hospital, had gone with Dr. Marcel to check the facilities. The bamboo beds were not in place, and the toilets were filled with grass, bamboo curls, mud, and cement dust. It was far from ready for occupancy. Elsie and Nita started to clean the toilets while the doctor and Sister Romolda consulted with Commander Yamaji, who had suddenly appeared on the scene. He told Dr. Marcel to call the girls to start setting the bamboo beds where they belonged. Elsie heard Dr. Marcel call, but she whispered to Nita to pretend that they hadn't heard. They were anxious to finish cleaning the toilets before going inside. When the next summons was more insistent, they decided that they had better appear. Yamaji was in a terrible temper. "Did you hear us calling you?" he roared. "Well, yes," Elsie answered, but he cut her off, demanding to know why they hadn't come. "We were cleaning the toilets." His face was contorted with rage, and with his open hand he gave her a vicious slap across the side of her head. She was knocked to the ground, her head ringing. When she saw him grab his cane, she threw up her hands to protect her head and caught the full force of the blow across her wrist. Sister Romolda tried to grab his arm, yelling, "Don't do that, she's only a girl." Infuriated, he started to use a cane on Sister Romolda. Shocked that he dared treat a nun in that manner, Elsie tried to rise, yelling, "You can't hit her like that, she's a nun." Further interference was more than Yamaji could endure. He started to kick Elsie with his heavy boot. She dropped back onto the ground, almost paralyzed from the pain near her kidneys. Yamaji must have thought that he had killed her, for he stopped dead still, blinking in the eyes, looking at her. Sister Romolda and Nita were on their knees beside her. A moan assured him that Elsie was still alive. He snapped, "Get this place cleaned up!" With that, he turned and left the building. It was well that Dr. Marcel had been shocked into immobility, for had he interfered, Yamaji would probably have killed him. Without an x-ray, the doctor could not ascertain whether any of Elsie's bones were broken, though he thought it possible that her eardrum had burst, for she was deaf in that ear. Elsie's wrists were more seriously damaged than was thought at the time, for they remained swollen and healed deformed. Her jaw had begun to swell and discolor. When Elsie could walk, Nita escorted her back to her barracks. I was shocked when she stepped over the threshold. The left side of her face was swollen out of shape. "Elsie, you're hurt. What happened?" Her grin was courageous and lopsided, but her eyes held none of her characteristic merry twinkle. I knew she was in pain. "Well, Mrs. Deibler, I just had a run-in with our good friend Mr. Yamaji." Then she filled in the details, showing me her bruised body. Rose had only to look at her daughter to know that something was terribly wrong. "Now, Mom, it's all right. Our good friend Yamaji just wanted to show us that he's the big boss." With considerable bravado, she told the story. To cloak her fear of what Yamaji might yet do to her daughter, Rose scolded her sharply. Now, how could she be so stupid knowing what kind of a man he was. Had she already forgotten what had happened to her mother? Sensing how agitated her mother had become, Elsie tried to soothe her, admitting how stupid she had been and promising that in the future she wouldn't repeat the performance. Pulling the improvised curtain around their section, we left them to rest. The bell signaled for us to stand up in the aisle at the front of our beds and be counted. Having responded to our bows with a salute, Commander Yamaji came, cane in hand, turned into our barracks and made his way to where the Davids stood before their beds. I followed him, as was customary when he made a bed-by-bed inspection, praying that the Lord would smite him with impotence to do further harm to this family. He stood and looked at Elsie, then arose. A hush pregnant with fear prevailed over the whole barracks. Finally, after what seemed to be an eternity, he shook his cane in Elsie's direction and said to Rose, "You have a very stupid daughter. I tell her to come and she doesn't obey. She's rude. She's stupid. Do you know that?" In an attempt to pacify him, Rose immediately responded, "Oh, yes, sir. I already told her she was very stupid. I told her she should have obeyed you. Yes, sir, my daughter is very stupid." Feeling somewhat vindicated, Yamaji turned to Elsie, and with a final shake of his cane in her face said, "If I tell you to do something in the future, you obey. Do you hear?" Her left eye, now almost swollen shut, Elsie looked up at him very meekly, replying, "Yes, sir." We made our way back to the front of the barracks. As he appeared in the different direction of the next 4 barracks, I released a sigh of thanksgiving that no more violence had been done. In weariness of spirit and emotionally drained, I stretched out on my rack, reviewing what had happened, still seeing Elsie's battered body and bruised face. Phrases from the Gospel of Matthew were going through my mind. Love your enemies. Do good to those who despitefully use you. Pray for your enemies. All right, Lord, I'll pray for him. I sincerely don't want the man to be lost eternally, but I really would like it if you would curdle the food in his stomach tonight, and would you stretch him on the rack of his conscience, at least for a while. How very much easier it is to be philosophical about and forgive the wrongs done to oneself than to forgive the injustices done to the people we love. With sufficient provocation, there is within each of us the potential to violence, but for the grace of Almighty God. Without you, Lord, what might I have become? Forgive me, Lord. With a prayer for God to have mercy on the man, I cried off to sleep. The wave of dysentery had not abated, our isolation ward notwithstanding. It took more than a bit of soap and water to kill the dysentery germ. With little emetine for the treatment of the amoebic strain and sulfa unknown to us for the bacillary type, we had to trust that the patient was physically strong enough to be purged with salts repeatedly, then starved in an attempt to cleanse the system, stop the diarrhea, and allow the inflamed intestines to heal. When a measure of relief had been attained, rice water was given the patient, and later plain rice porridge. If the diarrhea remained under control, the patient graduated to plain rice in gradually increasing amounts. It was one thing to use such drastic treatment with adults who understood the why, but for the little ones it was cruel. Sometimes it was almost not to be endured. Oh God, was it not awful? The pleading, hurt, haunted look in the eyes of the small ones, whimpering, not able to understand why they were being thus treated. The agony of the mothers not being able to feed their sick babies was almost unbearable. The eyes of the mothers took on the same haunted look as they clutched their little ones to their breasts, rocking back and forth, groaning and whispering words of love until sleep eased the stomach cramps and hunger pains. I had to encourage the mothers to believe that their children never doubted that they were loved. When, like these little ones, I didn't understand God's dealing with me, I prayed, "Be patient, Father. Forgive my tears and whimperings. Just let me feel your arms of love about me. Then my heart shall understand. I shall stop my questioning and know that you mean it